This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, the 21st of April, 2024. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Dale Franks.
I'm Michael Wade.
And everything is working. We are good to go. Hi, Michael. It's good to talk to you again.
Same.
I'm almost afraid to start this podcast because it's going to start off with basically a lot of negativity. Usually we try to end on a negative note. Here I think we're starting on a negative note, although the full implications of the negativity might not be immediately obvious from the beginning, but I think we have a point that we'll get to, but I actually just want to go ahead and show the stuff at first. So the first thing that I want to discuss is this: the vote for the $80 billion Ukraine aid bill in the House. This is how it turned out: 310 in favor. So Ukraine aid bill passes. Now, I'm going to go full screen on this. And what I would invite you to do is I invite you to turn your attention to the left side of the screen, or what is to me the left side of the screen. I'm not entirely sure whether this is transposed or not. When you're watching it on video, it looks like everything is fine, so it should be the left side of your screen as well. But let's just kick this thing off and let's just watch. I wanted to keep the volume up so that we could actually hear the yells of Ukraine, as congressmen wave Ukrainian flags on the floor of the House, largely Democrats. And one can't help but think of this much in the same way of Jesus talking of the Pharisees and the Sadducees praying in public. It's nothing more than virtue signaling. But why are they virtue signaling on behalf of another country? And as Rand Paul points out, interesting that they're happily working to secure Ukraine's borders, but not ours. So, point one. Point two, another little video from Tucker Carlson on the Joe Rogan podcast, which I think is instructive.
Well, you could say the same about the atomic bomb, right?
Yes, you could.
And you could say that we have to develop it like Oppenheimer felt before the Nazis did.
I love that. How'd that work?
We won at it.
How'd that work?
Well,
I love, by the way, that people on my side, I'll just admit it, on the right, have spent the last 80 years defending dropping nuclear weapons on civilians. Like, are you joking?
right.
That's just like prima facie evil.
Yeah.
If you can't, if we hadn't done that, then this, that, the other thing, that was actually a great savings. Like, no, it's wrong to drop nuclear weapons on people. And if you find yourself arguing that it's a good thing to drop nuclear weapons on people, then you are evil. Like, it's not a tough one, right? It's not a hard call for you. It's not a hard call for me. So with that in mind, like, why would you want nuclear weapons? It's like just a mindless, childish sort of intellectual exercise to justify, like, oh no, it's really good because someone else will get it. How about no? How about like spending all of your effort to prevent this from happening? Would you kill baby Hitler, famously?
Right.
So I don't know why we're sitting back and allowing this to happen if we really believe it will extinguish the human race or enslave the human race. Like,
okay, well, his views on our current use of nuclear weapons. I have some points to make, by the way, about this Tucker Carlson thing, but go ahead and label me evil for the interim until we get to.
I'm down with you.
Until we get to that. Then our next, and it's not a video, it's just something from Candace Owens. Americans know nothing about real history. Well, I'm prepared to be lectured by the master then. Did you know that 12 million Germans were ethnically cleansed after World War II? Did you know 500,000 of them were murdered for the crime of speaking German? Not exactly, but okay. Children were lined up and shot. Well over 2 Women and 2 million women and children were raped at the end of the war. Many of them died or killed themselves as a result. In Czechoslovakia, they lined German civilians up, many of whom had lived there for centuries, ran over their legs with trucks, forced them to dig their own graves. Not all of them were German. Some of them just spoke German. 12 million German civilians were expelled across Eastern Europe, forced stripped of their homes and property and citizenry for the crime of speaking German. Again, not exactly. Hundreds of thousands of them starved to death. This ethnic expulsion was the largest in human history, and you've never heard about it. Why? And then there's some documentary from Daily Motion going up here, and someone down here talking about, did you know that that hundreds of thousands of women and girls were raped by the Allied soldiers? Technically true.
Said Russian.
Technically true, but it wasn't the Americans who were running Czechoslovakia in 1946 or Eastern Germany. And many of those millions of people who died were German POWs who died in Siberia because the Russians wouldn't let them go. But sure, it was the Allies. Okay, fine. So point 3. Point 4, Columbia University. The Orthodox rabbi at Columbia University has basically sent out a things that says Columbia University's public safety and NYPD cannot guarantee Jewish student safety in the face of extreme anti-Semitism and anarchy. Deeply pained to say that I would strongly recommend that you return home as possible and remain home until the reality in and around campus has dramatically improved. Some have made reference to Nazi Germany in the 1930s, preventing Jewish students from entering the university. I myself would point to 1957, or actually 1962, with James Meredith trying to attend the University of Mississippi, which required the National Guard to be called out just to allow him on the campus. I thought we were past all that. Apparently not. Point number 5. University of California at San Diego has a new policy now with certain majors you can't get into. You can apply to get into, but it's not a first-come, first-served basis. Preference is given to students whose parents make $45,000 or less who are not college educated, so you have to be a first-generation college student. And they have several selective majors where you can't get into and you can't enroll, although you can apply once per year between the spring and summer semesters to change your major. But if some of the other people who they prefer are applying, you're on a wait list and you can't get in unless all of those people who want to apply, lower income students, your first generation college students. And in fact, this is on the UCSD website about selective majors. So you can apply to selective majors once per year. The selection criteria for entry will consider your academic achievement in the screening courses, but they will also be aligned with UC San Diego's priorities of serving California residents, which honestly I don't have a problem with. First-generation college students and students from low-income families. Now that all sounds nice, except that it's not really a meritocracy at the university anymore. So your grades don't matter. What matters is, did your parents go to college? Do your parents make more than $45,000 a year? In which case, we don't care how smart you are, because apparently some sin of your parents now prevents you from getting into certain selected majors. So you can't even get into the School of Biological Science, Data Science, Public Health, Bioengineering, Chemical Engineering, Computer Science, Electrical and Computer Engineering, Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering, Nanoengineering, or Structural Engineering. So biology or engineering are basically closed avenues to you if you are not poor and a first-time college student. Now, I think this is probably an attempt to apply racial preferences without saying they're racial preferences, but they're doing it on an economic basis, which, by the way, I've never had a problem with on an economic basis, but this seems a rather draconian way of implementing it. And certainly the meritocratic way would be to allow anyone who has the appropriate grades or the highest grades to get in.
Especially when you're talking about engineering and biochemical engineering.
Yeah, you would think that would be kind of important to have super competent people. But anyway, that's the new policy. And look, I get the argument that what happened in the past was that meritocracy was used as an excuse to implement racial exclusion in certain fields. But the answer to that is to stop using competence as an excuse for racial prejudice, not to just elide past competence almost completely on behalf of some perceived social good. All of these things, and they're in very disparate areas, and they don't appear to be related except in one way. They do appear to be related to a culture that is in steep and perhaps permanent decline. A culture that is, I don't want to use the word degenerate, because that has such negative connotations. And there's another word that's kind of like that, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But
Decadent.
Decadent. That is exactly the word I was looking for. Thank you. It is a decadent culture who want to elide past reality because there are simply comforting viewpoints, which we will conveniently refer to as my truth. And there was another one, and I forgot to find it. And it's what's her name over at NPR, who talked about, oh gosh, now I've got to find it. Now I've got to find it because we got to see it. So excuse me, pardon me.
Is it the court lady?
No. It's the NPR.
That's Greenberg.
No, the head of NPR. NPR.
The CEO, Mayor.
Yeah. This thing that she does it with this super saccharine delivery to try to make it sound so, and she actually has two statements that they found from her, but it was the first one that was I have the second one, it just popped up immediately, but it was the first one about just being aggressively free speech, and she was talking about what she did at Wikimedia, but in one she's talking about, well, let's just I actually want to find both of them. Gosh darn it. So I have one. So forgive me, I had an hour to do show prep, and this completely lost my mind, but it fits in with what we're talking about. NPR CEO, truth. It was something about truth, the pursuit of truth. Here it is. I got it. So two things that I think we want to watch again on this, and listen to this. Listen to her.
The hard things, the places where we are prone to disagreement, say politics and religion. Well, as it turns out, not only does Wikipedia's model work there, it actually works really well. Because in our normal lives, these contentious conversations tend to erupt over disagreement about what the truth actually is. But the people who write these articles, they're not focused on the truth. They're focused on something else, which is the best of what we can know right now. And after 7 years of working with these brilliant folks, I've come to believe that they are onto something, that perhaps for our most tricky disagreements, seeking the truth and seeking to convince others of the truth might not be the right place to start. In fact, our reverence for the truth might be a distraction that's getting in the way of finding common ground and getting things done. Now, that is not to say that the truth doesn't exist, nor is it to say that the truth isn't important. Clearly, the search for the truth has led us to do great things, to learn great things. But I think if I were to really ask you to think about this, One of the things that we could all acknowledge is that part of the reason we have such glorious chronicles to the human experience in all forms of culture is because we acknowledge there are many different truths. And so in the spirit of that, I'm certain that the truth exists for you and probably for the person sitting next to you. But this may not be the same truth. This is because the truth of the matter is very often, for many people, what happens when we merge facts about the world with our beliefs about the world. So we all have different truths. They're based on things like where we come from, how we were raised, and how other people perceive us.
So that's number one. And if you can get over the irritation of being addressed as if you were a particularly dull, small child or a golden retriever, and listen to the content of what she says, that is a statement, that's a belief in which the entire undoing of Western civilization is encapsulated.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, that's clearly directly against everything we learned out of the Enlightenment, everything out of the Age of Reason. I mean, the famous philosophers upon which we have based most of our ideas about life would disagree with her vehemently. And it's just odd to hear someone say the truth is a distraction. That's just so odd.
Yes, it's more important than we get along, than we have these discussions about the truth.
Pretty little lies make the world go round.
But
yeah,
wait,
okay.
It gets better.
The number one challenge here that we see and is, of course, the First Amendment in the United States is a fairly robust protection of rights, and that is a protection of rights both for platforms, which I actually think is very important, that platforms have those rights to be able to regulate what kind of content they want on their sites. But it also means that it is a little bit tricky to really address some of the real challenges of where does bad information come from and sort of the influence peddlers who have made a real market economy around it. The number one challenge here that we
So, the First Amendment is such a hindrance to
It does tend to get in the way.
Yeah, especially when these people use their rights to force other people to try to accept their truth rather than the truth. All of these things, I think, have one thread running through them, which is the decadence that is destroying not only our commitment to the truth, as Catherine Mayer's last two statements indicated, but the ability to even think well about known facts.
I mean, Orwell is like, did I nail it or what?
Like Tucker Carlson's thing on the atomic bomb. Look, there's some complexity to it, but I think there are two arguments that I would posit that basically shoot Tucker Carlson's moral assumption that, well, if you think dropping nuclear weapons on civilians is moral, then you're just evil. Well, now let's wait a minute. First of all, had we invaded Japan, the number of lives lost would have made the number of people killed by the atomic bomb have paled in comparison. If given a choice between invading that country and taking it over inch by inch and forcing our soldiers to slaughter civilians who are coming at them with pikes and swords and sharpened stakes, which is basically what the Japanese government was issuing to its people, expecting a full-on civilian defense of Japan. The slaughter would have been horrific. It is not unreasonable to assume that millions of Japanese would have been killed over what would have probably taken added at least another full year or year and a half to the war. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, of course, would have consequently died as well. The peace that was bought by the atomic bomb was cheap at the price.
Yeah, very much so.
Second,
And
however,
Hirohito was not in any position. He was not going to give up until we dropped that bomb on Nagasaki. He was not going to give up.
You say Hirohito, but what's her name over at the Naval War College had an interesting point on that. She was asked about, and I forget her name. I could probably find it if I looked it up real quick. But she was asked. She's a professor of strategy at the Naval War College, has been for several years, and she was asked about Hirohito and said, at what point could Hirohito have stopped all this? Could Hirohito have stopped World War II? Could he have stopped the attack? And she laughed. And she said, Hirohito didn't know anything about this. Hirohito knew about guppies. He's a guy who studied fish in his backyard. He was literally a figurehead. And he had no...
Fair enough.
He had no real ability to stop. Once the militarists took over and they really overturned the policies of the Meiji generation and turned Japan onto the militaristic path, he did not have either the military or strategic expertise. Look, if the Japanese military had come up with something about going to war against fish, I'm sure that Hirohito would have been a great advocate for ichthyology. Outside of that, the guy was not well educated and didn't really know anything about governance. And he basically allowed his government to do... I mean, you talk about England being a constitutional monarchy. Japan, which technically is where the emperor has had single and sole authority, technically, basically was run along the lines of a constitutional monarchy, certainly under Hirohito, who sort of participated as a figurehead. It is entirely unclear how much ability Hirohito had to influence anything. And in fact, it wasn't until we dropped 2 atomic bombs on them that Hirohito felt secure enough against assassination, because remember, he had an underage son who would have been a perfect puppet. And Japan's government from the 1910s all the way through the 1940s was largely a government of advancement via assassination. And they could have bumped him off and put his minor child on the throne, who would have technically been the emperor, but he wouldn't have run anything. But that aside, when we talk about the morality of dropping the atomic bomb, there is another moral consideration that I think we have to make, which is that while we might have moral strictures against conducting war in a certain way against civilians, as a general rule, I don't think that necessarily over or outweighs the consideration of reciprocity. When you are a government who has participated in, let's say, the rape of Nanking, the intentional murder and dismemberment of POWs, who were technically, according to the rules, your charge, when you feel that you can just elide past all of the rules of civilized society, it then becomes somewhat disingenuous for you to jump up at the end of it whenever you're losing and saying, no, wait a second, there are rules here. No, well, there are rules? No, there are no rules. We're going to play by your rules, because one of the things that in our moral universe we have to consider is reciprocity. If you treat us in this way, even though we would not do the same to you, there are certain strictures that we should be perfectly willing, that we would normally not impose on our own initiative, but in response to what you're doing. No, you don't get to complain that we're not fighting fair now.
Yeah, once you open the door, we're going through.
Yeah, once you set the rules, we're going to play by your rules. They may not be our rules, and we may not like them. But if that means that we're going to firebomb Dresden, then guess what? We're going to firebomb Dresden, because that's what you've been doing since 1940 in Britain and Russia and everywhere else. You don't get to say, oh, wait a second, we all have to play fair.
Yeah, you don't
here.
cry uncle now.
Yeah. No. We're going to play by your rules. Reciprocity is an important moral consideration, because if you don't invoke reciprocity, then it becomes much more difficult to defeat an enemy who doesn't consider themselves bound by the same moral strictures.
We can bear witness to. Ever since World War II, we've dropped that moral position, and wars aren't won anymore. At least not by the aggressors. Or
the defenders. You mean they tend to be won by the aggressors.
Well, no, because we can't. I mean, I'm assuming that we would be deemed, the U.S. would be deemed aggressors in places like Vietnam, Korea, Iraq. I mean, I think that's a fair characterization. Provoked, absolutely, but we took the war to them.
Okay, that wouldn't be true in Korea, but
Korea and Vietnam are a little bit different.
Yeah, Vietnam is a lot.
We were reacting to the communist invasions.
Yeah, well, but of course in Korea it was an actual war. In Vietnam it was largely an insurgency at first.
Right.
Although our involvement there rapidly turned it into a war.
Turned it into a war. A war we could have won, except, matter of fact, we had one. I mean, we basically had the war won after the Tet Offensive failed, and then we went into and we bombed the fucking hell out of North Vietnam. We offered them a truce, set up terms. They rejected it. We bombed the fucking hell out of them. They were done. They had no air support. They had nothing. We were as good as won at that point, and we let it go.
Yeah, well, Vietnam, complex topic. And yes, we could have, and certainly in the communist world, they did picture us as the aggressors. But this thing about the atomic bomb, and to hear Tucker Carlson come out and say that.
I don't even know where he's going with that. I don't even understand why he's come up with that. It's an absolutely idiotic stance. Of course we use the atomic bombs. What the hell? We needed to save American lives. They attacked the homeland.
Yeah, hey, first of all, don't think that we wouldn't have used the atomic bomb on Berlin. Well, we didn't bomb Tokyo, so we probably would have used the atomic bomb somewhere in Germany. Just, pour encourager les autres, if we had it before the war had ended.
Yes.
And we dropped. And by the way, don't think for an instant that Hideki Tojo or Adolf Hitler would not have used atomic bombs on American troops.
That's exactly right. They were
American
planning on doing that exact thing.
Yeah, if they'd have had access to them,
that's what they planned on.
Yeah, if they'd have had access to them, they would have undeniably used them. And the Germans certainly would have used them. Yeah. They would have used them against Britain without even thinking twice. They would have bombed London and laughed about it. So, it kind of irks me today when I see this from Japan a lot, where there's all we're the only people who had atomic bombs dropped on us. Yeah, you're also the only people.
America.
Yeah, you're also the only people who participated in the rape of Nanking. So if we want to talk about what you're the only people who did, there's a lot of you're the only people who did this in World War II stuff. Even the Germans. Not so much with the Russian prisoners of war, but even the Germans with British and American and other Allied prisoners of war, even they generally abided by the Geneva Convention, despite the fact that Adolf Hitler at one point ordered commandos to be executed on site, and in fact at one point considered having Allied airmen executed on site. The fact is, they largely didn't do that, and you ended up in a POW camp, and the Germans let the Red Cross come in. Japanese didn't play that game.
No. And let's be clear. I mean, the Germans and the Italians were definitely shooting at parachutists dropping in country, which is a no-no under the Geneva Conventions. And guess what? The Americans were firing back, which is also not okay under the Geneva Conventions.
We did it too. In fact, by the way, interesting thing that I learned this past week that I had not known previously. The actor Charles Durning was one of the only survivors of the Malmedy massacre in World War II.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, he was part of the unit that was captured by the SS.
I didn't even know he fought.
Yes, he fought in World War II. He was captured by the Germans at Malmedy, and he was there when they machine gunned those 79 POWs. He was one of like 2 or 3 of the U.S. soldiers who survived that massacre.
He's a big motherfucker, too.
Yeah, he wasn't quite that big in 1944, but he gained a little weight over the years. But, who hasn't? Let's just say. But after Malmedy, there were a lot. There's a picture, historical picture of some German POWs that the Canadians printed, and they were captured by the Canadians. And a lot of these Germans seem to have been beaten up pretty good. And the line was, the Canadians took these German soldiers surrender after they had been attacked by civilians. That wasn't entirely true. They were SS soldiers who were captured, and the Canadians beat the shit out of them just for GPs because of things like the Malmedy massacre. Technically, yes, a war crime.
Shit happens.
Yeah. Out at the pointy end of the spear, things aren't always as clear. But whenever you talk about policy, Tucker Carlson is just completely wrong. It's so childish. It's a childish view of what it is. And today, would we advocate the first use of nuclear weapons? I think our policy has generally been no.
Right.
But do we have them? Sure.
It's still there. And I'm glad we have them, because Russia has them, because China has them.
Yes, because the people who you can't trust to use them responsibly, absent a significant deterrent, also have them.
Right. I mean, North Korea's got them.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like a first grader's understanding of strategy. No, nuclear weapons are just bad. Nuclear weapons are, in themselves, their very existence is evil. And so therefore, if you possess them and you encourage their possession, you must be evil as well. Okay, it answers a lot of questions, except for one: what do we do when the Russians and Chinese have them too?
Right. And it's a kindergartner's kind of view of the world, that if we're just all nice to each other, then everybody will get along. Yeah, no, it's not how the world works.
Yeah, and by the way,
certainly not how it works today.
It astounds me, coming from Tucker Carlson, who does not, at 56 years of age, seem to be the same fella he was at 35. And look, my views have evolved on a lot of things, but my principles haven't.
I'm rather shocked by his position as well. I mean, he knows the playbook, he understands the policies, and yet he goes there. I just don't even understand why. It's a dumb comment. It's a dumb thought. It's been argued now for decades. We've run through all the scenarios. It's a settled question. Yes, of course we had to drop the bomb. Period. There's literally no argument about it anymore.
And if the positions had
been, why keep bringing it up?
And if the positions had been reversed, it is undeniable that they would have used nuclear weapons on.
Absolutely, they would have.
I mean, there's simply no question about it. And again, the principle of reciprocity is important here. If you decide, it's one of the things I've noticed that Kurt Schlichter has done when he talks about some of the policy things where Democrats want to change this or change that, or they want to get rid of the filibuster or whatever. And he's always come out and said, look, if we don't like your rules, but if you impose those rules, I suggest we play by them. And you may not.
Yeah, he is very strong about that.
You may not like
the result. And he loves pointing it out to him too. Hey, your rules. This is how it works. Fuck off.
Yep. Reciprocity is a thing. If these are the rules that you want to apply, we don't like those rules and we think they're wrong, but we have to play by them because this is the playing field you want to play on. Then this is the playing field we'll play on.
Right.
All of these things just strike me. First of all, the ahistoricity of it. For your Candace Owens, who, God bless her, is cute and she's glib and she's a great public speaker, but God doesn't have a thought in her empty little head. And this talk about, well, did you realize?
She's not very well informed. She's well informed on economics and on political ideology, but no, she does not know history. Yes, she's bringing up historical facts, but they're very skewed. Matter of fact, the only person I've ever heard push those types of things are children of German refugees. I mean, it's like I'm supposed to feel sorry for the Nazis. I don't really feel that sorry. I mean, the Germans caused two major wars in 20 years. Yeah, they kind of got what they deserved. Treaty of Versailles, the reparations payment after World War One. Yeah, that was Dickley, and that was all France. But I mean, the Germans did this on their own. They didn't have to do it.
No. As awful as it is to say, when you play with fire, you're liable to get burned.
Right?
And
you can't fuck people over like especially World War II Germany. Holy crap.
Yeah,
the way they treated people.
If you want to talk about ethnic cleansing,
right?
It's going to take a lot of argument for me to go for it's not fair to ethnically cleanse the Germans argument after they just spent the last 5 years ethnically cleansing all of Eastern Europe and Western Russia. Yeah.
And Austria wasn't too happy about being annexed either. I mean, they didn't put up much of a fuss, obviously, but
no,
there were plenty of Austrians who were like,
gotcha.
I don't know if I want to be involved in this.
Yeah, well, Austria is a whole complex subject because they were already under a clerical fascist dictatorship.
That's right, yeah.
In any event, it wasn't like Austria was a free country. They had their own. It wasn't Nazism exactly because it was this weird Roman Catholic clerical fascist dictatorship that the Austrians
had. It was almost
had.
more like old school feudalism in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but
you're right. Under the veneer of a protectorate of the Catholic Church kind of thing. It was really old school Holy Roman Empire.
Yes, it was. Yeah, Austria was just a super weird place in the 1930s, but yeah. It wasn't by any stretch a free country. No. But just the ahistoricity of these things, and I think it all illustrates what Catherine Maher is talking about everybody has our truth. You can't maintain a society on your truth. There has to be a truth. And look, we can go down into the rabbit hole on the handling of COVID and the scientific argument about masks, or the argument about COVID's origins, which was largely controlled, at least at the beginning, by Peter Daszak, who is, a close ally of Anthony Fauci. The whole thing about Ukraine and what's going on there, and our unwillingness to try to find some sort of modus vivendi that will allow some sort of negotiated peace there. Because Ukraine isn't, if the Russians have done anything, what they've managed to do is start to unify a real sense of Ukrainian nationality, which largely didn't exist prior to 2014. To the extent that Ukrainians now consider themselves an independent, distinct people from Russia, the Russians have largely accomplished doing that.
Yeah.
They would have been far better off to leave Ukraine alone and just to slowly work inside Donbass and the other regions, to have them in Crimea, to have them just willingly break away, because they probably could have gotten away with that.
Well, and they have worked on that. I mean, they've inserted their people there to slowly undermine any kind of pro-Kiev government or politicians, and get them to look more towards Mother Russia. So they've been doing that for decades. But you're right that they, as far as mainland Ukraine, there's much more a sense of self and of nationality there now. Of course, they're still stuck with a really corrupt government and all the other issues that comes with. And we're not doing anything about that. We're just handing them money hand over fist. We have no accounting for it. And it's a slap in the face of like our border patrol people. When we're spending $95 million on foreign country, $95 billion on foreign country, and not a lick of that money, not a lick of policy goes to help at the border, at our own border, where there's a fucking crisis, and everybody knows it.
Yeah, again, it's another sign of decadence because
Yeah,
and look, I bow to no man in my interest in seeing Russia defeated and humiliated.
absolutely.
Aside of a brief period in the mid-90s, Russia has always been an autocracy. It's always been run by a strong man at the top. They don't know anything about democracy, and they are too paranoid and too militarily adventuristic to be trusted, even though they are also militaristically incompetent. So I bow to no man in my interest in seeing Russia defeated, but largely that has already happened. Russia as a world power is in.
They've shot their wad, and they know it. I mean, they're hanging on fumes.
Yeah, they're in serious
Whatever they
decline.
might accomplish in Ukraine, it's depleted them so much and given it's exposed the paper tiger that they actually are.
But what I find fascinating is our policy response to it. I mean, when congressmen are waving Ukrainian flags and yelling Ukraine,
That's just so weird.
That is pure virtue signaling that accomplishes nothing other than to say, look, I'm on the right side of this particular issue.
Again, decadence, right?
But it's
I have
decadence.
the ability to elevate myself by waving this stupid little flag, and I am now more important and more judicious and fair than everybody else. I am a savior. Wave my little flag.
Yeah, and I will do nothing about the border. I will do nothing about policies that actually affect the lives of real Americans, because let's face it. Look, if Russia were to take over Ukraine, that would not be a good thing, and it would certainly put Poland in danger. And okay, I get that. But if we don't do anything about the border, that puts us in danger. Why aren't we doing things about that? There are so many policy things that directly affect the American people that are just being completely ignored. Joe Biden has decided not to refill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which great on a day-to-day basis doesn't matter. But if we ever need the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, it will matter, and it'll matter a lot.
Yeah, and the reason they're not doing it is because it's too damn expensive because of their own policies.
Exactly. And you can't, I just went to the grocery store this week, and I bought maybe a week and a half worth of groceries. I bought 4 different types of meats, some vegetables, some low carb ice cream, and a couple of other things, 2 head of cabbage. Anyway, it was $215 for what are essentially basically 6 or 7 days of food. Maybe I could stretch that out to 10, but over the course of a month, that's $600-ish just to go to the grocery store. These policies,
and you're feeding 2 people. Try feeding 5.
Yeah, well, these policies matter. These inflation matters, and the fact that the inflation is largely a monetary policy, largely caused by spending money we don't have. Sure, much of it to Social Security and Medicare, but $60 billion to Ukraine is a bit of a drop in the bucket of $6 trillion of annual spending. But that's the problem, $6 trillion of annual spending. We're $31 trillion in debt. Fortunately, the Fed still holds $4 trillion of that on its balance sheet, so it doesn't count as publicly held debt. But the fact is, we are, and by the way, that's another sign of decadence, being so decadent that you can't even be reasonably frugal with your public spending.
Oh yeah, what would
because it's just so much easier to go in debt.
Calvin Coolidge and Andrew, who was the Secretary of Treasury,
Andrew Mellon.
Yes, Mellon would have a field day. Matter of fact, Mellon's book is absolutely fascinating. It's dry, but it is fascinating about what he goes on a lot about. It's a moral duty to keep that budget balanced. and to not waste taxpayer dollars. And Coolidge and Mellon were fantastic when it came to handling our nation's finances, tamping down on overtaxing and overregulating America. Probably one of the best presidents we've ever had was Calvin Coolidge.
Yes, well, silent Cal Coolidge is still silent, but I bet he's spinning like a machine lathe in his grave.
Yeah. I mean, looking at what they do now,
Well,
I mean, every 100 days, a little over 100 days, I think, we spend $1 trillion through the U.S. government.
yeah, well,
Every 100 days.
of course, Calvin Coolidge and Andrew Mellon hadn't come to the realization that if I just squander taxpayer money by promising to give money back to the people, then I can simply buy votes.
Yeah, well, that waited about a decade until FDR.
Yeah. By the way, one of my favorite stories about Calvin Coolidge was he was at a state dinner, and he was called Silent Cal because the man rarely spoke. He was not a sociable fellow. And there was a state dinner at the White House, and some lady was sat next beside him, and she said, "Mr. President, I have a bet that I can get you to say more than 2 words for the whole dinner." And he looked at her and said, "You lose." And didn't speak to her for the rest of the evening. But yeah, I think our theme for this podcast is decadence.
And I think that's a really good theme, because you're right. We are so rich and so well off that we can afford to have these silly little problems become nationally focused. Silly little problems like, oh, you didn't use my pronouns correctly. Really? That's a national issue? That's like a big deal? You're trying to change the English language?
These are, what we have is this huge boutique of what I would call luxury beliefs.
Yes.
Because we are so rich and so well insulated from the harsh realities that so many other countries have to live with on a daily basis, that we can live in a pretend world where these things are important and they matter, because we are cushioned by 2 centuries worth of wealth creation and accumulation that have given us a greater amount of privilege than could even be imagined by the kings of ancient times.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Well, what's the old saw? Good times make weak men make hard times make good men, or hard men. We're in that weak men stage. We are so pampered, we have lost the plot. Talk about ahistorical. We have lost the plot about how much work it took to get this far, and on whose backs we stand, on the giants whose shoulders we stand on. We've gotten rid of them. We've forgotten them. We've lambasted them. We've turned them into a joke.
But what we've also forgotten is the incredible amount of work it takes to maintain the civilization that we've built. Because there is, I forget who it was the British philosopher who said in the 18th century, there is an enormous amount of ruin in a society, meaning that once you are rich enough, you can have a lot of things go wrong and still live a reasonably good life. And you don't notice how bad things are getting until you use up the last of your seed corn, you use up the last of your investment, and now you have nothing left. And everything crashes in an instant. It's like we've talked about previously in monetary policy. Monetary problems don't slowly just get worse and worse and worse and worse. Monetary problems begin building up, and things look worse and worse, but everything kind of works right up until the point where it doesn't. And then when it doesn't, nothing works. And civilizations work largely in the same way. They work fine right up until the point that some you lose sight of what it takes to maintain your civilization. Then you
it's
burn
gradually, and then all at once.
You burn through the investment of previous centuries, and then when that's gone, you're left with nothing, and everything falls apart. And
absolutely true.
And it seems to me that we are in the business of busily burning through all of the capital, cultural, social, legal, that has been built for us over the centuries, and are on the verge of overturning the whole thing. And I don't know what that collapse looks like. What do we do when the electricity is no longer flowing? Just that one simple thing. What do we do when we can't keep the electrical grid up anymore?
Buy milk and toilet paper.
Yeah, well, that milk's only going to last you for a while without refrigeration, so you better chug that stuff down.
I'm just going by every blizzard I've been.
Yeah, well, this is a blizzard that will last for 100 years, so it's a little different.
People
situation.
don't realize how fragile our existence is. Hell, if we lost the internet tomorrow, how many people would just be absolutely flummoxed, not know what to do about anything?
How many people would be out of work? If we lost the internet tomorrow, I wouldn't have a job.
Right?
I mean, I work in an industry that literally could not have existed 20 years ago.
I could still work, but it would be a lot harder. It would take a lot more time, and it'd be a lot more expensive.
You'd need a lot
I
more
have to
of
do
those.
everything by the phone.
You need a lot more of those yellow legal pads.
That's right.
Yeah, but by the way, if the
change everything.
If the internet goes down, you're not going to have phones.
No, that's right. Because almost everybody has cell phone only now. Almost nobody has landlines.
And by the way, if the internet goes down, I'm not sure the landlines work either. Not anymore.
That's probably true. They've got to be on a VoIP system somewhere, right?
Yeah. The old days of everything being connected by copper wires to a big switchboard downtown. Yeah. Hello, operator. Give me Klondike 8745. Yeah. It would take us years to go back to that.
Yeah. I mean, just the infrastructure alone. How would you do it? Most of it's gone. It's been replaced. Yeah, it's been replaced by computers and radio. Fiber optics and telephone lines aren't even really telephone lines anymore. They carry electricity, and that's about it. Yeah, but it's not like anybody's on DSL anymore. No. So, we have the most advanced and yet at the same time the most precarious civilization that has ever been built. Chaos science predicted this, by the way. Yeah, so it is not helpful. Or say chaos theory. It is not helpful to have as fragile a civilization as we now have. A civilization that requires constant daily work, much of it highly technical and highly factually dependent to keep going. And if that fails, there's no one even left. Look, it doesn't even matter what industry you're in. Let's say that you run a retail store, right? Let's just say you run Walmart. Without computers, that doesn't work. Just-in-time inventory goes away. Right. Oh, that's out the window. Which means all of this, these tiny little warehouses, no. You're going to have to build warehouses on the back of all your retail stores to hold stock now because you have no way. Or you're going to have to go in and you have to wait 3 weeks for anything to get to you. You can go in and order some Dapper Dan hair gel. Yeah, but it's going to take 3 weeks. Sears might have to come back with catalogs. Right. And by the way, we couldn't support the population that we have now. No. Fortunately, we are self-sufficient in food and could be self-sufficient in energy. So in the United States, we're better off than everybody else. We would way better off. We
we could probably go back to 1940s and 1950s technology. It would take us about a decade to get there. Probably about 70 to 100 million of us would die on the way, but we could probably eventually get there.
And we'd save most of Canada and Mexico at the same time.
Yeah, but if you live in South America or in Africa or most places in Asia, that's it. You will not be able to sustain your population. And it requires a commitment to factual truth and reality. Only a decadent, rich society can ignore reality. And you can't even do that forever. And
even the Soviet Union wasn't a rich country, but it somehow dealt with Lysenkoism to its detriment, but much quicker than it would happen here. Unfortunately, we're dealing with Lysenkoism now.
Yeah, all it took for Lysenkoism to get thrown over the edge was for Stalin to die.
Yeah.
Because
30 years later.
He really liked Trofim Lysenko. But by the way, it's still too late. It retarded the advancement of Soviet biological science for decades.
That's right. And yeah, they're still recovering from it.
Yeah, and they're still recovering from it. Because, I mean, he was the officially approved agronomist of the party, so how could he possibly be wrong? Because if he's wrong, then perhaps scientific socialism is wrong, and we can't allow that. And by the way, the Soviets were perfectly happy to ignore reality for as long as they did, and they managed to get away with it for 70 years.
Yeah.
But when Gorbachev took over, after Brezhnev died, and then we went through that real quick succession of Andropov and what was that? Chernenko, that old fella, and then it finally settled on Gorbachev in 85. It was too late. The Soviet Union was already going to collapse. They had ignored reality.
Gorbachev was managing the decline. That's all he was doing.
Yeah, that was, and the only reason why he came out with perestroika and all that other stuff was because it was obvious that that system was collapsing wholesale.
Because Reagan won. Reagan ramped up the fucking, the kitty and said, okay, we're going all in.
Yeah,
what are you going to do?
Certainly Reagan was a significant factor in the 1980s, but quite frankly, everything that we had done from the 1950s in terms of the policy of containment.
It was absolutely a cumulative effect. That's absolutely true, starting with Kennedy.
It just drove
and Eisenhower.
And by the way, in the 1980s, the Soviets were spending 55% of their GDP on the military. Do you know how much Germany spent in World War II on the military in terms of GDP during the war? 45%.
That's amazing.
And the Russians were doing 55% in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They bankrupted themselves because, well, look, when you have a system where you don't actually know how much anything costs, where you don't actually know what the people want, where the only requirements for production is what the party says you have to produce in its 5-year plan, which incentivizes everyone to lie because no one is sure that they're going to get the parts that they need to do stuff. So everybody is going to lie. So your 5-year plan, did it get accomplished? I don't know. Everybody will say that they accomplished their part. But
well, it was a myth anyway. I mean, they couldn't possibly control every aspect of the economy. They had a hard enough time trying to control just grain prices. They had to allow local economies to do their thing, which obviously they did a lot on barter, but they had to have private sales. It wouldn't have worked otherwise.
Yeah, and by the way, that 1% of your land that you could commit to private sales produced about 75% of the Soviet Union's food by the 1980s.
That's literally how they survived.
They literally survived by allowing people
Talk about tragedy of the commons.
Yeah, to put 1% of their land into private production and sell it at local markets. That's how bad the Soviet system was. And yet, the only thing that kept that system together for the 70 years that it stayed together was because they had a totalitarian police state.
Yep.
And
a uniparty.
And a uniparty. And I think the thing that concerns me looking at what's happening to us right now is that, well, look at how Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, putatively a Republican, basically just caved to the Democrats, gave them exactly what they want in terms of Ukraine, the border, and whatnot. I mean, yeah, 112 Republicans dissented on the Ukraine vote, but 100 voted with it. There's with the Democrats. There's definitely a uniparty. So we're already developing that. And we've talked about that a lot. I think the thing that really starts to concern me now is that we're also developing the police state. Because when you look into what both under Trump and Biden, government agencies were doing in terms of, if not demanding, at least strongly suggesting censorship of social media, the Biden administration's full-throated embrace of anti-disinformation campaigns and domestic terrorism. It looks like we're building the police state to go along with the uniparty as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's no secret that the country club Republicans, what does Ace of Spades always call them? Chamber of Commerce Republicans.
Yeah.
They love open borders. They love cheap labor. And it helps their friends. It puts money in their pockets for the next election. They do not represent the people. There are very few representatives of the people in Congress at all anymore. And that's where this uniparty comes into play, is they protect themselves and each other. You know, that's why they railed so hard against Trump. He's a complete outsider. That's why they don't want him to be voted for, is because the people are wrong. They shouldn't be allowed to pick somebody like that, is how they look at it. And they're fucking honest about it. They come right out and say it. And I don't know what you do about that, other than vote them out. But there needs to be a serious showing. Trump is an answer to that uniparty nonsense. Not a great answer, but a
forceful one.
Say,
not the best answer, but an answer, yes.
Yeah. And I mean, if he goes in there and disrupts things, great. Because that's what people need. They need the federal government off their fucking backs. And that's the biggest goddamn problem. The government thinks that they are in a much better position to judge what we do than we are. When it comes to our children, to our homes, to how we live, to where we live, to what we do on a daily basis. They want to control all of it.
Well, that's the conceit of what Thomas Sowell has called the vision of the anointed. They've decided, you know what? If you weren't such a rube and hayseed, I could let you run your life. But frankly, you're just not smart enough to run your life. I'm going to have to run it for you. You know, that was the whole premise of that book from the mid-2000s. What's the Matter with Kansas?
Yes.
Right? Where the whole argument of the book was, look, obviously voting Democrat is better for all of these people, and yet they refuse to do it. They simply, how is it that they don't recognize their own interests when it is so clearly aligned with the Democratic Party? Why do these people keep voting Republicans? Well, that assumes that they agree with your assessment of what their interests are.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing as, remember when Bill Clinton said in, was it 1996 or 1997?
I'd love to give you a tax cut. I just can't be sure that you'd spend it the way you need to.
It's like, oh my God. That truer words were never spoken by a politician, because that is exactly how they think. They can't be sure that we're going to use our freedoms in a way that they think is right. And it's like, do you not get the idea of freedom? Do you not understand the concept? Do you not understand your job? Because I don't think you do. You think it's to lord over us and be an aristocrat and tell us what to do, even though you won't do that same thing. That would be a real aristocrat.
There was a comedian, I can't remember his name. He's from Texas, and unfortunately passed away in the early 90s. But he had one of the things in his act about America and democracy and how the American government worked is, you are free to do what we tell you. You are free to do what we tell you. And it sure does seem prescient now.
Oh, was that Joe Bob? Was that Joe Bob?
No, and that wasn't Joe Bob. I forget the guy's name. He had like black hair. He was from Texas. And I'm sure I'll remember it as soon as we
get off, right? Yeah.
Better never than late. But I mean, that really seems prescient now, because that seems to be what certainly in terms of censorship of social media, that's what the federal government is saying. Look, you have free speech as long as you say the right stuff. I mean, you clearly shouldn't be saying things that are disinformation or that we consider disinformation. But of course, the problem with that is once the government decides something is disinformation, everything other than what they prefer you to say becomes disinformation, and it becomes regulatable by the federal government. That's why you can never give the government the power to determine what is true or what is false or what is disinformation or what is not, because they will always weaponize it. Always.
And nearly 250 years ago, our founders already had that in mind.
Yeah.
And man, were they right.
Yeah, they already knew. And yet we see that happening on a regular basis. And even outside of government now, there's so many private institutions that, they control what pronouns you're going to be required to use with various people. And by the way, that whole pronoun thing is such a perversion of the English language. The whole point of pronouns is so that I don't have to specifically identify you as an individual. If I have to learn a different pronoun for every single person, I'll just refer to them by name. Thanks.
Yeah.
Because now pronouns have completely lost their use. But of course, that's de rigueur in many academic and now even corporate business settings. There are certain things that may be said and certain things that may not be said. And the idea that a business now can compel speech that you may not ideologically agree with, not a power that we have previously thought businesses had, but it's a power that they've decided to arrogate. There are, in so many ways, the Enlightenment is just being thrown out like trash, because the important thing is that you publicly advocate for the current thing.
Yeah, that we all have to be on the same page. There can be no difference of thought.
We don't need to look for the truth, because the truth can prevent us from working together. And even I cannot give the saccharine sweet instructions to my Labrador Retriever tone that Catherine Mayer can give. But
what kills me is these people are all about diversity is our strength. Diversity is our strength. We need all this diversity. Okay, then how come every single time you take a diverse group, they all come out as the same gray blob, saying the same things, thinking the same things? How's that diverse? You're not producing diversity. So why is diversity important again? I don't get it.
We're producing physical diversity, but it's very important that we put the kibosh on ideological diversity. I mean, obviously we want to be tolerant, but here's the hole big enough to drive a truck through. We're tolerant of everything but intolerance.
Right. Well, except our intolerance.
And we get to define what's intolerant.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the funny thing about defining things. The reason that we don't want government involved in that is because the government's always going to, whoever makes the definition is going to define it in their behavior or in their favor, right? So we need actual neutral definitions. And that's something that's lacking. Talk about decadence. We now have the same word could mean 20 different things. They.
Well,
They.
the important
Fuck.
here's the thing about truth is that it can be uncomfortable. And truth might disagree with what you prefer to believe.
It often does.
And so therefore, an assault on truth in the guise of we have to, de-emphasize the truth in order to accomplish things together.
Right.
That is a very soft and very subtle way of saying the truth interferes with what I want to, may interfere with what I want to believe in. So it's best.
And what you want people to think.
So it's best to make the truth malleable, to make the truth
Right.
something that I can define on my own and change that definition if it suits me, because the truth is inconvenient. Because if people pay too close attention to the truth, it may be obvious that what I want to do or what my preferred policy is just going to be ineffective or has been ineffective.
Yeah, that was Winston in 1984. But I always think of Vince Vaughn in couples therapy when he gets scraped by the shark. And he goes into therapy and he's like, that's my truth. I know my truth. And the psychologist is like, oh boy.
Yeah, but
I mean, we can pretend that we have our own truths, and we certainly have our own experiences. But I'm a firm believer in capital T truth, that there's an actual truth, whether we see it or we don't. Not everybody is. I have one of my best friends, and I have been arguing about this for literally decades. And, his argument is always, well, look, I mean, they used to think that trash produced rats. That was truth. Yeah, but that wasn't capital T truth. That was a subjective truth. Capital T truth is it does not produce rats. And we know that.
yeah, that was I think what we're doing is confusing truth with belief, and even more narrowly, truth with what I want to believe.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
I want this to be true, so therefore it must be.
That's the decadence, that I want this. And normally when I want something, I can have it. So I'm going to have this.
Me, I.
Yep. Thanks, boomers.
Yeah, that's the decadence. The World War II generation, so my grandparents, right? They went through such hardship for basically their whole lives.
They still have Cool Whip.
Yeah, from 1935 to 1941, it was a global economic depression. And how we got ourselves out of a global economic depression was being thrown into a global catastrophic total war. And so from 1929 to 1945, first of all, the Depression was the years in which they were growing up. World War II were the years in which they spent the first part of their adult life. And what they came out of that with was a sense that we need to build two things. Number one, we need to build a country where my kids don't have to go through what I went through. And the second was, and the government is a great way of accomplishing that. Look at what we did in World War II. We all came together and the government led us to victory over Germany and Japan. And so I'm going to raise my kids in a much more privileged way, which I guess was great, but then they were never exposed. The reason why our grandparents were able to fight and win World War II and then come home and never mention it again was because they had had such hard lives. They had been prepared by hardship for that experience.
They had lost family members in World War I too.
Yeah. And so when they came back, they decided they were going to raise the baby boomers in a much more privileged life. And the baby boomers...
And they got around to fucking pretty quick, too.
Yeah, and the baby boomers began to accept that, hey, this is what things are supposed to be like. This is the way things are. This is the way that they'll always be. And
there are still people that think the 1950s were a dream world. And in a lot of ways, they were. At least for white people.
Yeah, for white people, the 1950s weren't bad.
Yeah.
If you were black, not so much.
Yeah, not so much.
Although, as I always say, the moral arc of America has always been towards greater liberty and for extending the initial promises made in the Declaration of Independence ultimately to everyone. Mm-hmm. However slow and dilatory we were
painful
in doing that, and however painful it was, eventually that is the arc of America. It's like
at least it was.
It's like the Greeks used to say, the wheels of the gods grind slowly, but ever so fine. And that has been sort of the mission of America, to expand the words of the opening of the Declaration of Independence to every American. And it took a long time to do that. And by the way, part of the reason why it took a long time to do that was the government. I mean, look, if it had not...
And not just the federal government, but local and state governments.
Look, if it had not been for Plessy versus Ferguson, that the necessity of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
And that was what, 1956?
No, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896.
Oh, not Plessy. I'm thinking Topeka.
Yeah, Plessy versus Ferguson was, of course, what upheld racial
separate
segregation in the South, separate but equal. Absent that, we could have had the Civil Rights Act of 1904 or 1914, not 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I mean, it was the government that held up, full recognition of black people as full citizens for years.
Well, hell, Woodrow Wilson actually reduced them from where they were at the time. In the teens.
Yeah, by the way, people don't realize that before Woodrow Wilson became president, the United States Army and the United States Navy, I believe both, were desegregated.
Yeah, they were fully integrated.
Woodrow Wilson resegregated the United States military when he became president.
And he kicked most of the black people out of the civil service as well.
Yes. It was our own government can't be trusted to uphold the rights and freedoms of Americans. That is why the Constitution...
Look at Korematsu.
That is why...
Korematsu was like 30 years later, 40 years later.
Yeah, but that is why the Constitution places such limits on the government. Because
that's right.
The Founding Fathers realized that no government can be trusted. Ultimately, every government in the Founding Fathers' conception was a necessary evil. And so should be limited to the extent possible to prevent it.
Leviathan is Leviathan. You've got to put the proper chains on Leviathan.
Yeah, and Korematsu, as you just... and the Supreme Court literally said, oh, yeah, sure, it's okay to throw Americans in camps because you think they might like another country, basically. In this case, it was the Japanese. Yeah, first they look funny, they don't look like the rest of us, and maybe they like Japan more than we think. So we're at war, let's toss them into camps. Oh, and then let's send recruiters into the camps to recruit the kids for the U.S. military so we can send them off to fight. I mean, let's not be fanatics about it.
It's still good law. It's never been explicitly overturned. Now, it's pretty much gutted, but it's still good law. It's never been overturned.
Yeah, I mean, we have actually paid reparations to
we have
all of the Japanese Americans who were interned in World War II. I think several successive governments said the internment camps were a bad thing. And by the way, in California, Chris and I have been there. You can actually go to one of the larger internment camps that is now a national park, and they can just sort of walk you through the entire history of the internment system in World War II.
You get a George Takei bobblehead there?
No, but that would be a great marketing opportunity. Oh my. So, yes, Korematsu is still the law of the land, technically. The Supreme Court Technically, the Supreme Court says the U.S. government can just round up American citizens on reasons of national security and place
That should
them
make
into
people
camps.
a little wary.
Yeah, Korematsu was one of those weird, war is awful in many ways. And one of the ways in America in which it is awful, which I think libertarians appreciate, but which others often do not, is that war always increases the power of the state at the expense of the people. And
Yes.
once those powers are gained, it becomes almost impossible to claw them back.
It's like emergency powers. Once you get them, when does it end? And who controls when it's an emergency?
Yeah, once you get
We leave that
emergency
entirely
powers,
up to the executive.
yeah, once you get emergency powers, a lot of
I mean,
things
the
start
Enabling
looking like
Act
emergencies.
The Enabling Act of 1933 was enacted under emergency powers.
I'm not familiar with that one, the Enabling Act of 33.
And for Germany.
Oh, for Germany. Oh, yes. Because there were communists, and they
Right.
they found this Dutch guy.
There was a fire in the
they found,
Reichstag.
yeah, they found this Dutch guy, Marinus van der Lubbe, as commie as could be, also nutty as a fruitcake and delusionary. Nevertheless, commie. So clearly, we need to make the Nazi Party the only legal party in Germany. That's the only way to fight the commies. And,
It's amazing what emergencies can do.
and everybody signed off on it. And it's really weird. Adolf Hitler ruled from 1933 to 1945 solely on the basis of the Enabling Act that Hermann
Signed
Goering,
by von Hindenburg.
yeah,
Yep.
and by the way, pushed through the Reichstag after they arrested all of the communist deputies and all the social democrats, so that basically only the Nazis,
Nobody else is there to vote.
yeah, the Nazis, the Catholic Center Party, under Ernst Bruning, and a couple of other right-wing parties were the only people present. And Goering pushed it through, went to Hindenburg, he signed it, and on that legal basis alone, Adolf Hitler ruled Germany as the sole leader from 1933 to 1945.
Yeah, he promoted himself.
And by the way,
basically-
it is entirely unclear as to whether Marinus van der Lubbe acted alone or whether the SS actually let him into the Reichstag and also helped him out by setting up gasoline and setting fires while he was in there.
Yeah, we don't have confirmation of those facts. Well, we've got a lot of circumstantial evidence.
Yeah, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that says the SS already knew what he planned to do, and
Right.
they, let's say, made it real easy for him to be
Yes.
effective.
It was not a hard job for him to do.
Yeah, so, it's usually more difficult to burn down a stone building than that, and yet this crazy Dutch guy pulled it off. But
Yes. So, I mean, look, you give a government emergency powers, you give them, like under the Enabling Act, you give a central government official that kind of power. Of course, they're going to abuse it.
because
I mean,
that's what
what's that?
government
Lord
does.
Acton's saw is, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yes, that's absolutely what goes on.
Well, more
And it doesn't matter.
precisely, it was power tends to corrupt. Absolute power tends to corrupt, absolutely. Although tends is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that quote.
Do it a little bit heavy, yeah.
Well, look, Michael, we've been at this for about an hour and a half, so it's probably time to shut her down for this week. As always, pleasure to talk to you. Look forward to talking to you next week.
All right, bud. See y'all next week.
You have been watching the Observations podcast for Sunday, the 21st of April, 2024. Thanks for watching. We appreciate the fact that you do, and we hope that you'll be watching again next week. Until then, have a great week. So long.